Hello everyone, and welcome to the Yissilmissil Productions channel. My name is Steven Yissel, and today we are doing part 24 of our Bermuda Triangle deep dive series. We'll be continuing to read from this book, Into the Bermuda Triangle, by Gian J. Quasar. And today's chapter is Chapter 9, The Warnings of Lunar and Martian Anomalies. So I hope you're all having a good week. And thank you for being here on Friday instead of Thursday. I see we got Brenda in the chat here. Welcome to the show. Good to have you here. So last week, if you missed that show, we talked all about Atlantis. We got into some Edgar Casey. We looked at some old reliefs from Honduras and the Mayans. But today we're talking about UFOs. And we'll have some photographs at the end to show here. It's gonna be another 2-hour show, I feel. Oh man. It's just how this goes. These are long chapters, but not long enough to split it into two for today. So normally if it goes over 20 pages, I like to split the chapters in half. Yeah, every chapter is going to be about 20 pages from here on out. But we are almost done, as you can see. Almost done with part... I would call this book part 1 of a series from Quasar. But, yeah, we're getting there. I'd say in the next 3 weeks we'll finish up this book, and then we'll get into the part 2 book. But anyways, let's begin. This is gonna be another 2-hour show. Chapter 9. The Warnings of Lunar and Martian Anomalies. More than one investigator of prehistoric ruins has noted the pattern of their astronomical alignment with other planets and stars, and that there is a remarkable similarity between these patterns and geometric shapes seen on other heavenly bodies. This raises the question of exactly how far back civilization on this planet goes, and what stage it actually reached before perhaps being destroyed. If it had attained a significant degree of scientific and technological knowledge, it doesn't seem unlikely that it should have been preoccupied, as we are today, with space exploration and other planets. My apologies. Richard C. Hoagland, Mike Barra, Lan Fleming, Dr. Stanley McDaniel, and other lunar observers are of the opinion that the unusual shapes and patterns on the moon, formerly called lunar anomalies or geologic eccentricities, are man-made or at least intelligence-made artifacts built at some ancient time. Over the last 50 years, reports of these objects have proliferated. In 1954, reports of a 20-mile-long bridge over parts of the surrounding mountain range of the Mare Crisium elicited wide attention after being reported by distinguished English astronomer Dr. H.P. Wilkins, who described it vividly during a live BBC radio broadcast. In 1966, the greatest stir was caused by photographs taken of the Mare Tranquillitatis by Lunar Orbiter 2 when searching for landing spots for the upcoming Apollo manned mission in 1969. These photos revealed a rectangular, quote, pool, end quote, flanked by what appeared to be tall pyramids or obelisks, noted for the long shadows they cast and their regular spacing. William Blair of the Boeing Institute of Biotechnology innocently reported that they appeared man-made, which then set off a sensation followed by several caustic denouncements of the whole idea as absurd. The proliferation of such reports in the last decade may in part be because superior yet affordable telescopes capable of delineating far greater detail than in the past have been developed and marketed, enabling large numbers of amateur astronomers to gaze at the moon. In addition, NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab and Malin Space Sciences System upload the latest official photos on their websites. There is also an increasing re-examination of the photos taken by many earlier lunar expeditions and overflights, like Apollo 15, and more recently, Clementine, which was in 1994. Among the anomalous objects on the moon are geometric shapes: a triangle, a cross, and possibly a pentagon. Their placement implies they were designed for viewing from the Earth, all of which can be seen with a modest telescope. Other oddities include enigmatic flashing lights, especially in the crater Aristarchus, spelled Aristarchus, and reflections off what appear to be broken glass fragments. Ridicule is naturally hurled at the idea by people who cannot conceive that man, or anybody else, would build huge complexes on a body that cannot support life. But this is often only justified of the extreme, quote, lunar buffs, end quote, who see just about any shape or formation on the moon, like, quote, Roman cities, end quote, missile complexes, Los Angeles, and 600 square mile glass boxes covering parts of seas and whole craters. Just as there are people who can make out any forms they fancy in clouds, blots and large trees if they study them long enough and are diligent enough to find exotic topography. So another word for that is pareidolia. Lunacy, no pun intended, is attached in a sort of, quote, guilt by association, end quote, to the far more conservative discussions of long documented facts and observations that remain unexplained. The Mare Crisium, which is Latin for Sea of Crisis, has been a hotbed of anomalous sightings of reflected glares and sparkling flashes for the last 50 years. Most recently, lunar anomalists Mike Barra and Steve Troy have noted what appear to be huge glass domes in the Old Sea Basin. Examination of NASA photos from Apollo 10 yielded the unexpected detail. One photo, indexed as AS 10-30-4421, was an angled shot of the small crater Picard on the Mare seabed. And it's in quotes, so quote-unquote seabed. In the distance, however, Barra noted an unusually high point of albedo. In parentheses, this says derived from Latin meaning whiteness. And parentheses. Bright enough to appear as reflective glare. Blowing up the area of the photo revealed two perfect domes. One much closer to the crater than the other, with the texture of crystalline glass. This was suggested by the background mountain range clearly appearing through the transparent dome. Concentrating their examination on the nearest dome revealed there to be some sort of chimney on top, standing perfectly erect. On the hillside, in the distance behind it, there were what appeared to be a face and, less subjective, a, quote, phoenix, end quote. Some sort of flail or bird symbol etched vaguely in the hillside. This stood out because of its albedo, the natural character of moon rock beneath the old and undisturbed gray surface. Brief flashing or reflective lights on the moon have been recorded in astronomical observer records for the last 2 centuries. More recently, they have been seen by such distinguished astronomers as Winifred Sawtell Cameron of the Goddard Space Flight Center and Audouin Dolphus. So I'll spell this guy's name. AUDOIUN-DOLLFUS of the Observatoire de Paris. Dolphus proposed that phosphorescent gases were escaping from the bottom of the crater called Langrenus, and that's spelled Langrenus, in 1992 when he made his observations. He noted the glowing lights actually changed shape over several days. Steve Troy, on the other hand, believes the flashing lights could be sunlight hitting glass constructions or fragments of them at the right angle during the lunar sunrise. Why they are not seen at other times, he offers, can be explained by the theory that the sun has to hit them at just the right angle to produce a reflective glare. At all other times, they are invisible because of the transparency of the glass and the fact that the moon has no atmosphere. Some of the observations, he notes, have been of brilliant and brief flashes, which are suggestive of sunlight or other light briefly striking glass. From the Apollo 16 preliminary science report, subheading, quote, crew observations, end quote, page 5-4, comes the following detailed sighting of a typical TLP, or transient lunar phenomena. One of the most intriguing orbital observations was made at approximately 1:23:07 GET, or 3:01 p.m. Central Standard Time, April 21st, 1972. The CMP, or the Command Module Pilot, was watching the stars rise over the approaching sunrise horizon while he was waiting to execute one of the zodiacal light photographic sequences. While in a totally darkened cockpit, he noticed a bright flash that appeared to the south of the ground track and several degrees above the horizon. This flash was of very short duration and did not remain long enough to permit recording of a geographical position. That's the end of the excerpt. If these are the remnants of ruined glass artifacts or abandoned glass artifacts, in corpus toto, the question naturally crops up: why build on the moon? To this, Troy has a suggestion. There may have been ancient mining operations seeking the moon's very valuable minerals, although operations now plainly seem to have ceased. Some craters, in which mining for minerals might have been more advantageous, do have various dwellings or bunkers of odd circular and horned shapes, presenting the appearance of large bases and companion tubes, like the wide variety of objects together, making the so-called village in the vast impact crater Tycho, and that's spelled Tycho. From the point of view of an alien race, there seems little reason to build on the moon when a very habitable and rich planet is nearby. But from the perspective of an Earth culture reaching out into space, and one whose religious ideas may have centered on signs and geometric shapes and planetary grids, it does make sense that they would mark their first step into the solar system, mark significant astral alignments, and perhaps place religious markers to commemorate the event. The use of glass, however, remains unexplained, as it offers no protection from the scorching heat of the lunar day, which is 250 degrees Fahrenheit, or the freezing cold of the lunar night, unless, of course, atmosphere was pumped into these glass domes. Martian anomalies are, however, a different matter altogether. They have been seen since Giovanni Schiaparelli first sighted the, quote, canals, end quote, of Mars in 1877. So that guy's last name is spelled Schiaparelli. More credence is attached to the idea of life on Mars since it does have water and an atmosphere, though the water is believed to be frozen carbon dioxide and the atmosphere very thin compared to Earth's. This allows for more excitement when new discoveries are made, something with which Schiaparelli was familiar. His Italian canali for, quote, channels, end quote, was misinterpreted by the English press to mean canals and taken to imply man-made irrigation ditches. The excitement caused dozens of telescopes to be trained on Mars to see if our most intriguing neighbor was indeed inhabited. Percival Lowell was perhaps the most famous astronomer to do so. He even went to the expense of building his own Lowell Observatory in Arizona in 1894 and devoted his life to studying Mars to determine if there were civilizations there. He eventually concluded that there were. Although Viking and Mariner overflights and landings have indicated there is no civilization on Mars, the question, quote, was there ever, end quote, is being asked by an increasing number of observers. This is being prompted by some strange formations and images clearly captured in Mariner and Viking photography, some of which, under closer scrutiny, still cannot be explained as natural formations. One of the most interesting of these formations is the, quote, tunnels, end quote, or, quote, glass sandworms, end quote, of Mars. Long cylindrical tunnels that appear to have been made of a form of crystalline glass and reinforced at even intervals with supportive ribs. These extend for miles under the Martian desert, as determined by ground impressions, but for about a mile, one is exposed in an open fissure in the desert floor to reveal the startling appearance of a metro tube or a subterranean aqueduct. Measurements and photographs indicate that this tube is about 600 feet wide for most of its distance, but a curious area of distortion shows that it was, quote, ballooned, end quote. The effect is strikingly similar to that seen in hot glass when the craftsman blows through a glass tube to shape the hollow piece he is working on. This part of the tunnel also reflects the most light, something that is clearly visible even high up, and this seems to confirm that its appearance as glass is not illusionary. The ribbing around the glass, quote, tunnel, end quote, seems evenly placed, and where it has, quote, ballooned, end quote, the ribs appear stretched proportionately. However, some of the ribs seem to be creases in the, quote, glass, end quote, as if to indicate it is not necessarily hard glass, but a softer, transparent material. Like plastic designed for some give, though it has apparently undergone far more undulation than intended, with some of the frosted creases appearing as ribs where the long tube creased back and forth beyond its limitations. Among the most studied Martian anomalies is the so-called, quote, face on Mars, end quote. A curious plateau in which some see the heavily eroded features of a feline, sphinx, or human face. Since man has gazed at clouds and trees and seen any number of novel forms therein, with no two witnesses agreeing, the, quote, face on Mars, end quote, may directly reflect this same surrealism, or simply show the ability of individuals to see what they wish to see. The plateau on which the, quote, face, end quote, is chiseled, however, is perhaps itself the most extraordinary testimony to the fact that a natural formation was worked on to create some representation. Its shape is almost that of a perfect shield, with severe erosion having occurred on one side. Some straight lines never found in nature can still be made out at its rim. Using the plateau as a scale, the length of the remaining straight lines would still be remarkable. The quote, face, end quote, is not an isolated anomaly in this region of Mars. Anomaly researchers, primarily Richard Hoagland, having named this area Cydonia, spelled Cydonia, the city on Mars, after the section of Mars on which it appears. There are many more great geometric patterns here, including some odd shapes and possibly a pyramid. Other unusual sights include neat lines in the smooth bottom of the Valles Marineris. So that's spelled Valles Marineris. A vast canyon stretching around nearly 1/3 of the circumference of Mars. The lines extend for miles, crisscrossing both diagonally and tangentially, in a way similar to those on the Nazca Pampa in Peru. They bisect natural lines, indicating that they are not a natural formation or typical buckling from geologic action in the valley, or wind or water erosion. Some are even curved or oblique. It is hard to imagine what natural process could so neatly make one line straight and then make another curve around it or over it without disturbing or obliterating the previous line. Nearby, there are a number of enigmatic, quote, igloos, end quote, on the valley floor. Although craters can appear as domes from a distance due to the shadowing of sunlight, the shadows cast by these circular formations are on the outside of the circle, on the opposite side from where the full force of the sun is hitting, rather than on the inside, where they would be if these were craters in the valley floor. A number of these, quote, domes, end quote, show, quote, ejecta, end quote, that is, material ejected out of craters by the force of an impacting object. However, the ejecta sprays in only one direction, not all around the perimeter, as one would expect from an impact. Rather, it appears to vent only one way, as if debris coming out of a chimney was blown with the wind and discolored the valley floor. A prominent feature of all the nearby, quote, lines, end quote, is that they do not appear to be etched into the soil, but appear to be mounds, possibly covering something below. One is tempted to imagine more, quote, tunnels, end quote, like the one exposed. If so, perhaps Schiaparelli and Lowell will be vindicated, at least in thinking that canals or channels for irrigation existed on Mars, though they may represent subterranean irrigation. But unlike Lowell's later certain belief, there is no indication that they prove there is any present life on Mars. It is often speculated that any water on Mars must be channeled from its polar caps, where the greatest abundance lies frozen. Lowell believed the, quote, channels, end quote, that he saw were designed to direct the melting water during the Martian spring and irrigate the vegetation that he believed was the darker strands he saw on the Martian surface. However, it is tempting to consider, in this context, that daily need for water would require subterranean channeling to underground or domed, quote, hothouses, end quote, to maintain year-long vegetation and the less than desirable and cold atmosphere of Mars. If there were native vegetation on Mars' surface, it is thought that it would most likely grow near the polar caps, where it could access some of the frozen water and thrive when it melted in spring. It is precisely in this area where the coloration startlingly suggestive of vegetation has recently captured the attention of our world. Hey, Lerny. Good to have you here. What appear to be trees have been photographed by Mars Global Surveyor. They measure about 300 feet across and are about 50 feet high, and they appear to shed and change foliage with the season. Oases, forests, and sandy arroyos with bushes also seem indicated in the recent photographs, although officially these are explained as marks left by the defrosting of the polar caps during the Martian spring. It must be said nonetheless that this defrosting happens in very familiar patterns that we associate with green belts on Earth. The appearance of botanical, quote, life, end quote, on Mars has prompted a number of lively debates and comments. Sir Arthur C. Clarke, the inventor of the communications satellite and father of the 2001 A Space Odyssey concept, has publicly, in parentheses, says at the Wernher von Braun Memorial Lecture, end parentheses, he has publicly declared, quote, "I'm quite serious when I say, have a really good look at these new Mars images. Something is actually moving and changing with the seasons that suggests at least vegetation," end quote. He noted their likeness to banyan trees and added, quote, "I'm 95% sure that there are extensive areas of vegetation, or its equivalent, on Mars," end quote. In addition, he has recalled the scientific community's attention to the unexplained tunnels or worms on Mars, commenting, quote, "I'm still waiting for a good explanation of that colossal sandworm," end quote. The Mars Orbital Camera has also detected the possibility that ice was near the equator of Mars in the recent geological past, increasing the possibility that life could have existed in some form over most of the planet. Mars's future seems to be one of life, but in this case, Earth life. Yeah, I don't know about that one. NASA has already tentatively scheduled placing man on Mars by 2020. I'm going to pause right there. 2020. This book was written in 2004. And by 2041, possibly our first permanent colony. It is then and only then that we may determine what was on Mars in the past and if there was life and civilization there. What happened to them? Until then, we are left with some sobering and disturbing suggestions. Some of the most surprising Martian geologic anomalies involve a number of large craters that taper from the wide circumference of the lip down to a narrow bottom, like a giant funnel in the ground. These are quite unlike the common impact craters with their large flat bottoms and splatter-like rays, or ejecta, streaking out from their circumference. But they do have distressing counterparts on Earth. in the Nevada desert, 65 miles northwest of Las Vegas. The area of the Mojave and Great Basin deserts is pockmarked by hundreds of huge craters. One of the largest, Sedan crater, is 1,000 feet across. This crater was created by a 100 kiloton underground atomic blast. The 900 craters there were all created by atomic bomb tests conducted during the Cold War from 1951 to 1992. Their respective sizes directly reflecting the strengths of the bombs tested. And if you remember from my Coral Castle series, there's only certain parts on the grid where these bombs will activate. Otherwise, they're unarmed, they're undetonatable. Tourist guides who now conduct their curious charges through this formerly top secret area, and in parentheses, a source of revenue for the federal government, end parentheses, liken the area to the surface of the moon, as it is advertised as, quote, getting a taste of another world, end quote. The craters here, however, are nothing like anything seen elsewhere in the solar system, on our moon, the moons of Jupiter or Saturn, or any planet save the odd craters of Mars. Ancient texts of India describe several forms of warfare of a prehistoric civilization that are so unusual and fantastic they were naturally declared to be pure myth or heroic epics written by an ancient Indian Homer. Yet there is such a diaspora to the references of this type of warfare. They cannot be considered as from one imaginary source. They describe aerial warfare, given detailed descriptions of weapons remarkably similar to modern missiles and atomic bombs, given dimensions of flying machines, or give dimensions of flying machines called Vimanas, and that's spelled Vimanas, and even go into great detail about various different kinds of Vimanas, including those that traveled through space to other worlds, fired missiles, and were used in battles between heroes and demigods in space. It is possible, of course, that much of this recollection reflects Indian philosophical thought, were it not for the fact many of them were already obscure in ancient times, discarded by Indian priests and prophets as impossible to understand. An indication of their neglect can be gleaned from Dr. V.R. Ramachandra. I'm going to butcher this last name. Dikshitar, and that's spelled Dikshitar, who, holding the chair of Indian Studies at Oxford, lauded in his War in Ancient India, quote, "We owe much to the energetic scientists and researchers who plod persistently and carry their torches deep down into the caves and excavations of old and dig out valid testimonials pointing to the misty antiquity of the wonderful creations of humanity," end quote. Why these texts have been lost in deep caves or buried and ignored can be explained by their content, for there is much in these Indian Vedas, or scriptures, that seems to have no religious or moral instructional purpose whatsoever, such as details about great, quote, chariots, end quote, accelerating beyond the atmosphere. Elements of these extraordinary records, however, may have been extracted in very ancient times to inspire the background for some of the famous Indian epics. In the Mahavira Charita, Sita, a passenger in a chariot accelerating into orbit, gets a very accurate answer to her question. Quote, "How can it be that in daytime we see this circle of stars?" End quote. To which her husband, Rama, replies naturally enough, quote, "Owing to the great distance we cannot perceive it in the daytime, as our own eyes are dimmed by the rays of the sun, but now that is removed by the ascent of this chariot, and thus we see the circle of stars." End quote. Where the writer of the Mahavira Charita got his information, nobody knows. Only that it was very ancient, perhaps 3,500 years ago. And these compilations, roughly at the time of Moses, are said to come from earlier sources, as are other Indian epics that tell of great wars and the deeds of the gods and demigods. They may go back so far as to recall the same prehistoric civilization that Genesis mentions only in passing. After a flood, it must be remembered, mankind moved, quote, eastward, end quote, to build their great civilization, and India is certainly east from Mesopotamia. Here, Babalu, or Gate of the Gods, flourished and spread. As a matter of interest, all early cities around the Indus Valley in Pakistan were built of fired brick, in parentheses, the same material that the builders of Babel insisted on using, end quote. The cities of the Indus Valley were for some reason abandoned and lost for millennia. This so-called Harappan culture is hard to date, though it is thought to have flourished around the same time as Sumer and early Egypt. When excavation started on one of its cities, Mohenjo-Daro, or Mound of the Dead, intaglio seals were discovered engraved with remarkably fine detail, bearing a script so old it remains undecipherable. This script became more mysterious when it was discovered to match closely the script of Easter Island, some of which archaeologists believe came from the nautical expeditions of the Viracochas of Peru. And here we have some images. It says finely incised steatite seals from Mohenjo-Daro and Rongo from Easter Island. These same type of seals in writing have been found in Mesopotamian cities dated to 3rd millennium BC. Do they represent contact or the leftover trinkets of a previous single language and civilization? So Mohenjo-Daro, it's these ones here. Then Easter Island is the one on the left here. And I will get this in focus here in a moment. There we go. And then this bottom part is also from Rongo Dongo from Easter Island. So this one here goes with this text on the bottom, which is undecipherable. Or was as of 2004. Not sure if anything got updated on that, but I'm sure it didn't. All right, Brenda, sounds good. Thank you for being here. Parenthetically, we once again are reminded of that prehistoric civilization of one language, to that early Sanskrit used even in South America, to, quote, Peleg, end quote, and to legends of that one great civilization that went too far and was destroyed in what Sanskrit would call Atlantica, or Atlantis. The Jewish attitude of religious devotion and the Egyptian attitude of glorification of the state never made it conducive for either to recall past secular or foreign events with astounding detail. But the Indian attitude embraced recording great and sweeping events, travels, wars, man's interaction with gods and demigods, and man's enlightenment throughout these epic events. We may wonder today if this was because they were closer to some of these incredible events. Proximity to these alleged prehistoric events may not be the only reason Vedic literature is so detailed in its account of this fabulous civilization. Another suggestion may be justified in light of the theory that language division was caused by cataclysmic disturbance of the electromagnetic frequencies of the Earth. This is to see Chapter 8 for reference. So that was last week's chapter covers that. Since the studies of electromagnetic effects show that there is varying degree of influence on the human brain, dependent on the individual's location on the Earth and their specific biochemistry, one is tempted to believe that a sudden division of languages, as contained in such stories as the Tower of Babel and dozens of others around the world, would not have wiped out the, quote, mother language, end quote, but that it may have continued to be spoken by those unaffected. That's interesting. Pockets of Sanskrit having been identified even in ancient South America are hard to explain otherwise. It is possible that Vedic Sanskrit, only dating to the 2nd millennium BC, is actually the direct descendant of the, quote, mother language, end quote, and therefore the storehouse of a previous civilization's knowledge was still accessible to its scribes. So they're asking, is it possible that it could be that? Considering the quantity of Vedic writings, they must represent the heritage of what must have been the most prolific language in their prehistoric world. Although their content later came to be represented in stylized form, the older texts being uncovered today are disturbingly precise and scientific in their body. In the Sanskrit Samarangana Sutradhara, an entire chapter of about 230 stanzas laboriously details the principles of construction underlying many types of vimanas. They are said to move so fast as to make a noise that can be heard only faintly from the ground. In describing a vimana, the Sutradhara says, quote, strong and durable must the body of the Vimana be made, like a great flying bird of light material. Inside one must put the Mercury engine with its iron heating apparatus underneath. By means of the power latent in the Mercury, which sets the driving whirlwind in motion, a man sitting inside may travel a great distance in the sky. The movements of the Vimana are such that it can vertically ascend, vertically descend, move slanting forwards and backwards. With the help of the machines, human beings can fly in the air, and heavenly beings can come down to Earth. End quote. I'm going to pause real briefly here. Man, we've been going 50 minutes already. This could almost be read as an advertisement for Piper, Cessna, or Beechcraft, except none can enter the solar system, yet. None of the above has any religious or philosophical aspect to it, but seems rather like a truncated understanding of what had once long before been a basic science. More detailed scripts have been found to contain descriptions of various types of jet Vimanas. In the Samar, Vimanas are said to be, quote, iron machines, well knit and smooth, with a change of mercury that shot out of the back, with a charge of mercury that shot out of the back of, in the form of a roaring flame, end quote. As an example of how detailed and, in many cases, monotonous are the references to such machines, Indian journalist Mukul Sharma wrote in, quote, Flight Path, end quote, which appeared in the Times of India on April 8, 1999, that the Yantra Sarvasva, traditionally ascribed to Maharshi Bhardwaj the Wise, and that last name is spelled Bhardwaj, quote, consists of as many as 40 sections, of which one, the Vaimanika Prakarana, dealing with aeronautics, has 8 chapters, 100 topics, and 500 sutras, end quote. In it, he comments that Bhardwaj describes there were 3 types of Vimana. Quote, those that travel from place to place, those that travel from one country to another, those that travel between planets, end quote. The Vaimanika Shastra was discovered in a temple in 1875. This 4th century BC text, extensively copied and recopied over the preceding millennia, touches on several aspects of air travel, including steering, precautions for long flights, avoiding lightning and storms, switching to solar drive, and to draw an intersecting connection with 0-point energy, switching to some free energy source that remains elusive in translation but seems associated with gravity. The author of this Veda, or sacred writing, even cites as many as 70 authorities and 10 experts in aviation and antiquity, almost in bibliographical terms, but these sources are now lost or await discovery in the future. Myth and fancy cannot explain the details in the ancient epics and Vedas of India. To the ordinary listener, in those days there's much of the technical that would seem boring if repeated word for word. Hold on. Why would he even write this? To the ordinary listener in those days, there's much of the technical that would seem boring if repeated word for word by a contemporary raconteur. Because they differentiate between types of vimanas for various lengths of journey and comment that space travel involves a different element, quote, past the atmosphere, end quote. There seems to be some advanced knowledge of an earlier science which is contained, perhaps imperfectly, in the transcriptions of these texts during the last 3,500 years. Alright, Lerna, you take care. Thank you for stopping by here. I appreciate it. In the myth of the Persian flying carpets, the reader will remember they could fly anywhere and did so magically, without pages and pages being devoted to how they could. The Indian texts, however, are little concerned with magic, only with instruction about an actual object. Considering the style of the writings and how laboriously detailed they are, Andrew Thomas, and in parentheses it says we are not the first, so I take it that's his book, thinks it is better to view these as flight manuals on the care and control of vimanas. The Samara Sutradhara might even be called a scientific treatise, since it deals with construction, takeoff, cruising for thousands of miles, normal and forced landings, storage in a hangar, a Vimana Griha, and even possible collisions with birds. He has expressed, quote, "If this is the science fiction of antiquity, then it is the best that has ever been written," end quote. Examination of some recently found Vedas has proven that they had never been translated in the past, when the vernacular changed. As a result, many of the words in the narrative are not translatable, even by Sanskrit scholars, since the original word has no equivalent in succeeding dialects or modern tongues. For example, in the ancient Vaimanka Shastra, it is believed to be the embodiment of the ancient science of aeronautics. The description of a Vimana as in, quote, an apparatus which can go by its own force from place to place or globe to globe, end quote, is followed by a detailed description on how to build one. Dr. V. Raghavan, and that's spelled Raghaven, the retired head of the Sanskrit department of India's prestigious University of Madras, observes, quote, the text's revelations become even more astounding, 31 parts of which the machine consists are described, including a photographing mirror underneath. The text also enumerates 16 kinds of metal that are needed to construct the flying vehicle. Metals suitable, light, are 16 kinds, but only 3 of them are known to us today. The rest remain untranslatable. End quote. "16 kinds of metal, but only 3 are known to us today." That's great. See how much in the dark we are here? When remembering that they can go from, quote, globe to globe, end quote, one wonders if these missing metals are terrestrial metals at all. And one equally can wonder if an answer has not been found for the oddities on the moon, which have suggested ancient mining operations. Dr. Ruth Reyna, spelled Reyna, of the University of Chandigarh, that's spelled Chandrigarh, was recently called upon to translate old Vedas found in Tibet. She reported that they spoke of how to build interstellar spaceships into anti-gravity drives in stylized form, and that a voyage to the moon was discussed. Space-age weapons such as lasers and rays are also mentioned in Vedas, as well as nerve gas and numerous types of projectiles that spit forth fire. From the perspective of a land observer, they are described as zooming upward into the heavens, belching out fire from behind. One is the Mohanastra, spelled Mohanastra, the, quote, arrow of unconsciousness, end quote, which was hurled at the enemy and caused entire armies to fall asleep. In the Great War epic, the Mahabharata, that's spelled Mahabharata, a compilation of 200,000 verses considered to be the Indian Odyssey, there is a description of the powerful weapon called the Brahmastra, spelled Brahmastra, cruelly used against other peoples. It is described not in the detached manner of a legend, but with the clarity of an ancient journalist. And here's an excerpt of it. Hey Zenray, good to see you. Glad you could stop in here. Alright, so we're reading an excerpt too. From the Indian Odyssey, basically. Gurkha, flying in his swift and powerful Vimana, hurled against the 3 cities of the Vrishis, spelled Vrishis, and Hakas, spelled Andhakas. A single projectile. So they hurled against the 3 cities. A single projectile charged with all the power of the universe. An incandescent column of smoke and fire, as brilliant as 10,000 suns, rose in all its splendor. It was the unknown weapon, the Iron Thunderbolt, a gigantic messenger of death which reduced to ashes the entire race of the Vrishnis and Hakas. The corpses were burnt. The corpses were so burnt, they were no longer recognizable. Hair and nails fell out. Pottery broke without cause. Foodstuffs were poisoned. To escape, the warriors threw themselves in streams to wash themselves and their equipment. That's the end of the excerpt there. But the most destructive weapons were launched from land. The impact of the Agenia, or Agnia, spelled Agneya, a dreaded projectile, after it was fired against an enemy, is described with commendable detail. So here's another excerpt. Dense arrows of flame, like a great shower, issued forth upon creation, encompassing the enemy. A thick gloom swiftly settled upon the Pandava hosts. All points of the compass were lost in darkness. Fierce winds began to blow. Clouds roared upward, showering dust and gravel. Birds coaked madly. That's Coaked. The very elements seemed disturbed. The sun seemed to waver in the heavens. The earth shook, scorched by the terrible violent heat of this weapon. Elephants burst into flame and ran to and fro in a frenzy. Over the vast area, other animals crumpled to the ground and died. From all points of the compass, the arrows of flame rained continuously and fiercely. That's the end of the excerpt. In other sutras, the, quote, cloud roaring upward, end quote, is described as, quote, parasols opening up one over the other, end quote. A disturbing parallel, as linguist Charles Berlitz notes, quote, with a modern mushroom cloud, end quote, after an atomic blast. It was so dreadful that it was banned by the, quote, gods, end quote. In this context, it is worth considering that the, quote, tower, end quote, in Babel to reach, quote, heaven, end quote, was an impoverished recollection of a launching platform to send, quote, towers, end quote, an epic term to describe projectiles, into the heavens. And for this reason, God destroyed and scattered the civilization. Quote, for this they began to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them which they imagined to do. End quote. Incidentally, no archaeologist has ever discovered any great actual tower that could possibly fit, quote, Babel, end quote. So that taking from this Indian literature, the Tower of Babel could have been the Rocket of Babel. That makes kind of sense, right? It kind of makes sense. That's why they've never found a tower. It was a missile silo, right? It is interesting to note that these great stones at Baalbek in Lebanon are actually not the first course of blocks, but the top course. They sit on blocks of monumental, though comprehensible size, indicating that the large 70-foot stones on top were necessary to withstand some terrific repelling force from above. All of this could, of course, represent pure imagination and reflect the ability of man to spin tall tales and equally to believe them. But the dogma that it could not have happened is just as, if not more, unwarranted and without any supporting evidence. It hinges of the basic precept that change and progress are one and the same. In the words of Indian philosopher Sri Aurobindo Ghosh, in observing Occidental thought, quote, European scholarship regards human civilization as a recent progression, starting yesterday with the Fiji Islander and ending today with Rockefeller, conceiving ancient culture as necessarily half-savage culture. It is a superstition of modern thought that the march of knowledge has always been linear, end quote. He goes on to lament, quote, our vision of prehistory is terribly inadequate, end quote. And I'd agree with that. In this context, it might be wise to inject the population problem today. Not too many, but too few. This has confounded mathematicians, biologists, anthropologists, and sociologists. If mankind is as old on Earth for as long as believed, the present world population is only a fraction of what it should be. Presuming an estimate of 100 million inhabitants for the Roman Empire, a generous estimate, at its zenith, and taking into account other peoples of the world, a rough estimate of 300 million souls on Earth 2,000 years ago can be made. Even with civil collapse in the Roman Empire, the ravages of China by the mighty Khan, wars, plagues, famines, and the like, all over the earth, mankind has reached over 6 billion souls today in fewer than 2,000 years. But if rational man goes back as far as 40,000 or 50,000 years, or even 10,000 years before that, there should be billions and billions more of the human species everywhere, unless, of course, billions were killed or died in some unexplained event long ago. And we have a drawing here. It says Baalbek, what the actual huge edifice must have looked like before the Romans built their temple on it. They resemble the great stones underwater off Morocco. Could the great upheavals that might have overwhelmed the Earth in the last 10,000 years have been unleashed by human beings themselves? A great flood could have been initiated by pollutants, forming nuclei that could have brought down a water vapor canopy. A splitting of the continents might have been precipitated by a society's own destructive weapons. Indian Vedas give tragic body to the succession of impacts recalled by Amerindians in South America, and of the crater-like configuration in parts of the Bermuda Triangle's coastlines. It is interesting to comment, while on this topic, that some of the enemies these ancient texts mention are not even historically known to ancient India, but many represent cultures far away on the Earth. May represent cultures far away on the Earth. We must remember that certain Vimanas were capable of long flights. Furthermore, in northern India and the Gobi Desert, fossils are found to be highly radioactive, as are certain ruined, quote, city, end quote, sites in the northern part of India that are still not completely excavated or identified, though they are linked with the mythical 7 cities of Rish, that's spelled R-I-S-H, which may end up not to be mythical at all, but simply to have existed so far back in time that concrete knowledge of them was lost. There is also the fact that some of the ancient cultures of the Americas and India mysteriously vanished, all of which is suggestive of sudden destruction. There would appear to be no enemy locally, but if the Vedas are true, an ancient world war might be implied. We must remember the great abundance of ancient tektites and Yissilmissil in areas of the Bermuda Triangle can only be found elsewhere at nuclear test beds or meteorite impact sites. This word is spelled Shtishovites. Shtishovites. I don't know. It's a lot of Indian words today. In this context, one might view the great disheveled stones in the Americas and the sunken ones of the Bahamas to be what is left of the enemies at which such things as Angeus and Brahmastras were hurled. According to D. Hatcher Childress, we're going to be reading his book in about 2 weeks on Coral Castle. Author of the Anti-Gravity Handbook, which I have. So we have multiple anti-gravity handbooks we're going to be looking through. He's the author of like 2 or 3 of them. One type of early Vimana is described as, quote, a double-deck circular aircraft with portholes and a dome, much as we would imagine a flying saucer, end quote. Thereby making it impossible to avoid the topics of UFOs and ancient astronauts, and that this technology did not come from Earth to begin with. He further observes some startling parallels between these ancient aircraft and modern reports of UFOs. Quote, it flew with the speed of the wind and gave forth a melodious sound. So it was like making music as it flew. There were at least 4 different types of Vimanas, some saucer-shaped, others like long cylinders, or cigar-shaped airships. Childress believes that the unidentified ruined cities of Pakistan and northern India, called the Rama Empire by modern scholars, were a vast civilization that flourished many thousands of years ago and back into prehistory. And in parentheses, the hypothetical time period is the 5th to 4th millennia BC, again the era just before and during the time of Babel, and then, quote, Peleg, end quote, and end parentheses. He identifies these with the legendary, quote, 7 cities of Rish, end quote, mentioned above. The earliest writers of the Hindu texts refer to this empire as having these wondrous flying machines. But, to draw a disquieting parallel, the cities are now, like the Bimini stones, mere ruins of unidentified cultures. After his long study of the ancient texts, Dr. Raghaven came to perhaps the most controversial conclusion, that this fantastic Earth culture of prehistory was influenced by extraterrestrials. He stated categorically, quote, 50 years of researching these ancient works convinces me that there are living beings on other planets, and that they visited Earth as far back as 4000 BC. End quote. He adds, quote, there's just a mass of fascinating information about flying machines, even fantastic science fiction weapons that can be found in translations of the Vedas, Indian epics, and other ancient Sanskrit texts. In the Ramayana, there is a description of Vimanas that navigated the great heights with the aid of quicksilver and a great propulsive wind. These were space vehicles similar to the so-called flying saucers reported throughout the world today. End quote. Raghaven's conclusions have not been maverick. Dr. A. V. Krishnamurthy, professor of aeronautics at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, has expressed a concurring opinion in which he observes, quote, "It is true that the ancient Indian Vedas and other texts refer to aeronautics, spaceships, flying machines, and ancient astronauts. A study of the Sanskrit texts has convinced me that ancient India did know the secret of building flying machines, and that those machines were patterned after spaceships coming from other planets." End quote. Extrasolar planets, or exoplanets, are believed definitely to exist. Some have even been, quote, charted, end quote, by, quote, wobbles, end quote, or eccentricities in other suns indicative of the gravitational pull of another heavenly body nearby. It was by this method that Urbain Leverrier, and that's spelled Laverrier, discovered Neptune from an eccentricity in Uranus's orbit. This led him to calculate precisely where the other planet must be. Modern high-precision radial velocity measurements are, as described by the European Southern Observatory in Geneva, a, quote, fundamental observational method based on the detection of changes in the velocity of the central star, due to the changing direction of the gravitational pull from an unseen exoplanet as it orbits the star. And unseen is in parentheses, so just for punctuation here. The evaluation of the measured velocity variations allows us to deduce the planet's orbit, in particular the period and the distance from the star, as well as a minimum pass, end quote. This method has led to a number of significant discoveries, including 130 known candidates for exoplanets, 11 of which were recently, quote, discovered, end quote, through international efforts organized by the Coralie and Elodie Hires programs carried out primarily at Geneva, Grenoble, and Haute-Provence observatories at the Center of Astrophysics in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Famed planet hunters Geoffrey Marcy and Robert Butler made a dual exoplanet discovery in 1996 in the 70 Virginis and 47 Ursae Majors systems. Both had confirmed the 1995 discovery of a planet around 51 Pegasi, a triple exoplanet system orbiting Upsilon Andromedae, was discovered in 1997 and confirmed by leading authorities such as Dr. R. Noyes and Dr. S. Korzenik. Strong interest remains centered around other stars such as Gliese, spelled Gliese 876, and Epsilon Eridani, where frequent eccentricities are noted. In searching for other planets, the primary interest is naturally to find life or where life may be possible. Although many of the exoplanets discovered are gas giants many times larger than Jupiter, on which life would be impossible, they offer some intriguing prospects. According to a press release from the international program based in Geneva. And here's an excerpt. With the exception of the planet Iota Hor B, so Hor, and then just the letter B, circular orbits among exoplanets have only been found for short period systems, contrary to what is the case for the giant planets in our own solar system. However, the orbit of the newly found planet near the Sun-like star HD 28185 is very nearly circular, with a period of 385 days, in parentheses, close to 1 Earth year, end parentheses. Its distance from the star, 150.6 million kilometers, is almost equal to the distance between the Sun and the Earth, which is, in parentheses, 149.6 million kilometers. End parentheses. This new planet is therefore located in the, quote, habitable zone, end quote, where temperatures like those on the Earth are possible. Still, it is a giant, gaseous planet, and in parentheses, with a minimum mass of 3.5 times that of Jupiter, or about 1,000 times that of Earth, end parentheses, and thus an unlikely place for the development of life. Nevertheless, it may be orbited by one or more moons on which a more bio-friendly environment has evolved. The presence of natural satellites, or moons, around giant extrasolar planets is not a far-fetched idea. Just look into our own solar system. That's the end of that excerpt there. It stands to reason that moons of such huge planets could be the size of Earth and support a thriving culture. Though not having a moon like ours, they would have as a night light the light of their sun reflecting off the breathtaking view of a multicolored planet like Jupiter, with gaseous festoons, great spots, quote, eyes, end quote, and swirling bands. Of course, what we are doing could be true on other planets and may have been ongoing for a considerably longer period of time. We must bear in mind that intelligences from other worlds may long ago have reached out toward the Earth. They may even have influenced the development of a previous civilization on Earth, as suggested above. The lunar and Martian anomalies noted, if needed, they were made by intelligences. Maybe footprints or celestial maps and markers of their pioneering toward Earth, and as such are leftovers of a civilization with no connection to the Earth other than having interfered with it ages ago. Indian epics are not alone in describing men coming down to Earth. The progenitors of the great antediluvian civilization of Genesis are called the Beni Elohim, or B'nai. They give pronunciation in parentheses. B'nai Ha-Elohim, or sons of God, or gods. Although today we interpret B'nai Ha-Elohim, variously as angels or Seths, as opposed to Cain's descendants. When it was translated by ancient Jewry, in parentheses, when they translated into the Greek of the Septuagint in the 3rd century BC, and parentheses, this one passage retains a direct translation as Uioi Totheou, sons of God. And that's 3 words spelled Uioi Toutheou. Perhaps because they felt angels was out of context when referring to inbreeding with women. Their progeny became the great men of the earth. Their origin is described in Genesis 6.1-4. Here's the excerpt. And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful. And they took them wives of all whom they chose. Then said the Lord God, by no means will my spirit remain in these men forever, for they are also flesh, for yet shall be their days 120 years. They were giants, and in brackets, Nephilim, end brackets, upon the earth in those days. And after that, whenever the sons of God came into the daughters of men, they bore children to them. Those were mighty men, and in brackets says Gibbor. It's spelled Ghibbor, which were of old, the men of renown. That's the end of the excerpt. Or, as in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Testament reads, quote, men of great name, end quote. Whoever the, quote, sons of God, end quote, were, it is only their progeny who did things worthy enough to make them stand out and be called great men. The tone of clarification in these verses also indicates that the people of the time were very familiar with the stories of great men, and that here they were being told exactly who these great men were, and from where they had come, plus a rough estimate of when it was. In any case, they and their civilization were long gone by the flood. In the Hebrew book of Enoch, a dominant book during the time of Christ, the Hebrew tradition that these were angels is clearly reflected, the belief being that they were 200 who came down to Mount Carmel under the leader Azazel. However, the language in Genesis clearly indicates that these were men, for God in his contempt says of the sons of God, quote, they are also flesh, end quote, which could be interpreted, quote, they are also only flesh, end quote. Genesis evidently implies that this went on for a considerable time, for their descendants were already upon the earth when other sons of God continued to sire children by the daughters of men. Identification of this progeny as both Nephilim and Gibbor remains obscure. It may be because Nephilim only connotes heritage, whereas Gibbor connotes abilities. Nephilim can have a dual meaning implying a caste or group from one origin. Quote, sons of the fallen ones, end quote. Or, quote, fellers, end quote. That is, those who destroyed mightily, as seen in the Indian Vedas. While the words are translated as, quote, giants, end quote, neither implies physical stature, merely greatness. Later in the books of Numbers and Deuteronomy, Nephilim and Gibor are used for the Anakim. That's spelled Anakim. Physical giants, the sons of Anak, who are not credited with any special divine heritage. Og, king of Bashan, is regarded as the last of the Anakim. The victorious Israelites were so impressed by his bed made of iron that they measured it 13.5 feet long, 6 feet wide. Possibly this association with, quote, giants, end quote, inspired early Jewry to translate such a rare word as Nephilim as, quote, giants, end quote. In parentheses says, Greek obtained a number of words from Semitic languages. The base of Nephilim, quote, Nephal, end quote, is part of Nephilos, which equals clouds. An interesting aside to the connotation, quote, fallen ones, end quote, and end parentheses. By the time of the Genesis compilation, from 15th to 14th centuries BC, their origin had long been only dim oral traditions that had been handed down and then tersely recorded on clay tablets in cuneiform. They exist in a paragraph in Genesis, and that is all. We must also remember the purpose of Genesis was not to write down in detail what other scrolls in circulation or other oral traditions said, but merely to give an overview of a very distant time leading up to Abraham and the Jewish people. The, quote, sons of God, end quote, remain enigmatic, as do their offspring. But to insist they were spacemen is to overlook the possibility that they could have merely been men from a more advanced earthly society who toyed with less developed cultures before a great flood. It is intriguing to contemplate this angle, also to wonder whether elements of a previous Earth civilization may have gone to other planets before a terrible flood, continental upheaval, or unrestrained warfare. Descriptions of saucer-shaped craft in ancient India, or the heavenly dish in which the gods gave information in Egyptian legend, could reflect the last vague memories of an advanced Earth civilization capable of having colonized the heavens. If UFOs today are definitely from another planet, one may wonder whether the civilization that sent them may indeed have originated on Earth long before it was reduced by cataclysms. If Earthmen have mounted to the stars at some ancient time, or if Earth has been visited by humans from other worlds, it is possible they came back to this planet, perhaps rediscovering it by accident or revering it as a sacred place of their own origin. They might at first have been extremely surprised by the present appearance of the planet, which their records and maps may indicate looked remarkably different from their ancestors looked remarkably different when their ancestors emigrated to colonize other planets. Nevertheless, it remains to be explained why so many UFOs are seen in the area of the Bermuda Triangle. Instead of considering modern UFOs and possible USO reports as representing little green men visiting Earth, they might just as well represent human beings, as frail as As frail and as imperfect as we are, returning to what is to them their mother world. They may view the ruins beneath the triangle as being the most valuable remnants remaining of a civilization they left behind long ago on a planet very different from ours today. But there is another possibility, indeed a striking one, unavoidable when ancient legends and recent developments in medicine are put together. This may tell us why men from other worlds or from a previous Earth would have to be based by the sea, and the geography of this part of the Atlantic may tell us why they would choose the Bermuda Triangle. So we just have 2 pages of photos here. So put away the slideshow for now. And we'll zoom in on the sub. All right. So first photo. The seabed of the Mare Crisium on the moon, showing the crater Picard center front. In the far distance, the highest point of albedo on the far right attracted lunar anomalists when studying the print. Blowing it up further revealed 2 domes, possibly crystalline glass. And this is from the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center 70mm film frame AS10-30-4421. And it also says, enlarged, the domes become apparent, their right sides reflecting the most light. And then the third image is enlarged to 200%. The perfect shape of the first dome is noteworthy. These examples follow the work of Mike Barra. And again, these are all from NASA, so take what you will from it. So that's a mountain range, and then it says primary dome, and then secondary dome to the right. Next, we have the Mars orbital camera picked up a high point of albedo on Mars's surface. Enlarging the photo reveals long, quote, worms, end quote, with the appearance of crystalline glass, exposed at areas where the Martian surface is cracked to create gorges. And this is from the Malin Space Science Systems, NASA's Find Channels. And this is MO 400291. So it looks like we have a wide image, and then again, so the same pattern as the first image where there's 2 zoom-ins. Enlarging further shows the worms of Mars in more detail. The high point of albedo originates at the area where the formerly subterranean worm has ballooned or been expanded by distortion. It is believed to measure 600 feet across here. It also appears that exhaust is coming out of its end, where the gorge forks. And more mysteries of Mars revealed by the Mars orbital camera. A Martian oasis. Notice the growth is heavier and thicker where it appears water once ran. Farther away, the growth bushes are smaller, more malnourished. Alright, so these first two here, we got this one showing the worms, and then the zoomed in portion here. And then here showing the vegetation. It just looks like an overhead shot of some forest and river, honestly. And the last page, it says Martian trees, ? They reminded Sir Arthur C. Clarke of banyan trees. Next, we have a weathered Martian mound in the shape of a heart. Yeah, this just doesn't want to pick it up. There we go. We have another unusually shaped mound, the face of Mars. Many believe this near-perfect shield-shaped mound was worked on in the past, but its features have long been eroded. Then next, an unusual crater on Mars, the big crater which funnels to a narrow bottom. Compare this with the Sedan crater. So we have North Peak, we have Pathfinder, we have Twin Peaks, and then we have the big crater which is on the bottom of the photo there. Like, that's as good as it's going to get because it's black and white here. And finally, the Sedan crater created in the Nevada desert by one of the 900 underground atomic test explosions. All right. That's all for Chapter 9 today. So next week's chapter is Chapter 10, titled Interest from a Past World? ? So whether or not you believe that NASA's telling us the truth or not, that's up to you, I guess, right? But the research in this book is going off the basis of the information that's given to the public. But it is diving deeper into these other aspects that not too many people cover. So that's why we're here looking at this every week. But anyways, that's going to do it for today. I really thank you all for being here. And sorry for not doing this yesterday. I had to move my schedule around. You know, I chose to make time for family. So whenever I'm able to do that, I will. That will always come first. So I'm still on the fence about Sunday. It's like it's a mystery. Is he going to show up? Is he not? So Sunday, just keep an eye out. 11 a.m. Central Standard Time. We'll probably follow up on the Let's Talk soon. If we don't do it on Sunday, we'll do it next Sunday. But as of right now, 50-50. I do have a lot of content to go over with that. But it's just going to take time. Just like this series. All of this stuff is just going to take time. So, I thank you for being here. Please make sure to leave a like below. And continue taking care of yourselves. But until the next one. Class dismissed.